The evening sun cast long shadows across the truck stop parking lot as a weathered Peterbilt pulled in, its driver expertly maneuvering the massive vehicle into a spot. Behind the wheel sat Tom Wheeler, a heavy-set man in his 50s whose appearance often led others to underestimate him. His salt-and-pepper beard and worn trucker cap painted the picture of just another long-haul driver, but there was much more to him than met the eye. 20 years of FBI service had taught Tom to always be aware of his surroundings, a habit that hadn't faded in the 5 years since he'd traded his badge for a commercial driver's license. He'd made the career switch seeking a quieter life, one where he could enjoy the open road and the simple pleasure of being his own boss. Most days, that's exactly what he got. This particular evening at the Prairie Wind truck stop in Nebraska, however, would prove to be anything but quiet. As Tom climbed down from his cab, his trained eye caught sight of 3 men lounging near the convenience store entrance. Something about their body language set off warning bells in his mind, the way they watched other drivers, the subtle hand signals they exchanged, the practiced casualness of their poses. During his FBI days, Tom had specialized in organized crime, particularly groups that targeted truckers and shipping operations. He recognized the telltale signs of predators sizing up potential marks. These weren't just ordinary troublemakers, they were professionals who knew what they were doing. Walking past them on his way to the store, Tom could feel their eyes following him. He heard one of them snicker, likely amused by his size and seemingly slow gait. The old familiar tension crept into his shoulders, not fear, but readiness. He'd learned long ago that appearing vulnerable could work to his advantage. Inside the store, Tom took his time selecting a sandwich and coffee, using the security mirrors to keep track of the men outside. Through the scratched glass, he watched as they approached 2 other truckers, engaging them in what appeared to be casual conversation. But Tom recognized their technique. They were fishing for information, likely trying to identify which trucks carried valuable cargo. The store clerk, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and a name tag reading Betty, seemed to sense something was off too. "Those fellows been hanging around since my shift started," she mentioned quietly as Tom approached the counter. "Making everyone nervous, but they ain't done nothing I can call the cops about yet." Tom nodded, keeping his voice low. "How long they been working this stop?" "Started seeing them about 2 weeks ago," Betty replied, glancing nervously toward the door. "Had a couple drivers report missing items from their trucks, but no proof it was them." As he paid for his items, Tom noticed one of the men had separated from the group and was walking between the parked trucks, casually testing door handles when he thought no one was looking. The other 2 had positioned themselves to block the view from the store's front windows. Tom's mind raced through possible scenarios. His first instinct was to call local law enforcement, but he knew from experience that without concrete evidence, the men would be long gone before any officers arrived. These types of criminals operated in the gray area, intimidating drivers but staying just shy of obvious illegal activity until they found the right target. Taking a seat at one of the small tables near the window, Tom pulled out his phone and appeared to be absorbed in it while actually using the camera to document the men's activities. Years of surveillance work had taught him how to observe without being obvious about it. He watched as they worked their way through the parking lot, following a pattern he'd seen countless times before. The cool air of the store provided a sharp contrast to the humid summer evening outside, and Tom could feel a familiar tension building in his gut. It wasn't just about stopping a potential crime now, it was about protecting his fellow drivers, many of whom were more vulnerable than him. He'd seen too many cases where truckers lost not just their cargo but their entire livelihoods to crews like this. As darkness began to settle over the truck stop, the parking lot lights flickered to life, casting harsh shadows between the rows of parked rigs. More drivers were pulling in for the night, and Tom noticed how the 3 men had adapted their strategy, becoming more selective in which trucks they approached. He recognized their methodology. They were looking for specific types of cargo, probably working off information they'd gathered about shipping routes and schedules. This wasn't random harassment, it was calculated and professional. The kind of operation he used to spend months investigating during his FBI days. What these men didn't realize was that they weren't just dealing with an ordinary trucker. They saw what they wanted to see, an overweight, middle-aged man who looked like an easy mark. But beneath Tom's unassuming exterior lay years of tactical training and experience in dealing with exactly their type of operation. As he finished his coffee, Tom began formulating a plan. He couldn't simply confront them, that would likely just drive them to another truck stop where they'd continue their activities. No, this situation called for something more strategic, something that would not only stop them tonight but potentially help law enforcement shut down their entire operation. The sound of raised voices drew his attention back to the parking lot. Through the window, he could see the three men had cornered a young driver against his truck. While their stance appeared casual to untrained eyes, Tom recognized the subtle positioning that left the driver with no easy escape route. It was time to act, but he needed to be smart about it. 2 decades of FBI work had taught him that rushing in without a proper plan could make things worse. Tom Wheeler stood up slowly, his mind already several steps ahead, drawing on years of experience in similar situations. What happened next would depend entirely on how these men responded to the realization that they'd picked the wrong trucker to mess with. But one thing was certain, this wouldn't be the quiet evening he'd planned for. The young driver's voice carried across the parking lot, trying to sound confident but betraying a slight tremor. "Look, guys, I already told you what's in my trailer. Just regular household goods." Tom recognized the fear in the driver's voice. He'd heard it countless times during his FBI days when civilians found themselves in situations they weren't prepared to handle. As Tom made his way across the lot, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping the line open in his pocket without speaking. It was an old trick he'd learned years ago. Dispatch would track the location and send units if they heard anything suspicious. He walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who didn't want to draw attention, but his mind was already mapping out every possible scenario. The tallest of the three men had positioned himself as the leader, standing slightly ahead of his companions. He wore a clean denim jacket despite the warm evening, likely concealing something in the inside pocket. His partners flanked him in a triangle formation that Tom knew wasn't accidental. It was a tactical position designed to control the space around their target. "Hey there, fellows," Tom called out, his voice carrying the friendly, slightly slow drawl he'd perfected over years of undercover work. "Getting kind of late for socializing, isn't it?" He made sure to stumble slightly as he approached, playing up the image of a tired, overweight trucker who might have had one too many cups of coffee. The leader turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. "This ain't your business, old-timer. Why don't you waddle back to your rig?" His companions chuckled, but Tom noticed how their eyes tracked his movements, assessing him despite their apparent dismissal. These weren't amateur thugs, they were professionals who didn't like unexpected variables in their plans. "Well now, see, that's where you're wrong," Tom replied, moving closer with the same deliberate pace. "When I see fellow drivers getting hassled at my regular stops, that is my business." He positioned himself carefully, appearing to simply lean against a nearby truck but actually placing himself between the young driver and the third man, who had been quietly moving to cut off any escape route. The leader's expression hardened. "Last warning, fat man. Walk away." His hand moved slightly toward his jacket, and Tom caught the telltale bulge of what was likely a concealed weapon. In his FBI days, Tom had faced down dozens of armed suspects, but he knew this situation required a different approach. He wasn't an agent anymore, and these men needed to be handled without escalating to violence. "You boys ever wonder why some of us older drivers keep doing this job?" Tom asked, his voice taking on a conversational tone that seemed to catch them off guard. "See, some of us, we did other things before trucking. Interesting things. The kind of things that teach you to spot crews like yours from a mile away." He reached slowly into his pocket, making sure they could all see his movements. Instead of a weapon, he pulled out his phone, which was still connected to 911. For instance, some of us might know exactly how to document criminal activity and transmit it to the right people. Some of us might even have friends in law enforcement who'd be mighty interested in your operation. The young driver, sensing the shift in dynamics, began edging away from the group. The leader noticed and took a step forward, but Tom smoothly intercepted, his bulk suddenly seeming more purposeful than cumbersome. "I've got about 20 minutes of video showing you boys checking truck doors, harassing drivers, and generally being where you shouldn't be. Now, that might not be enough for an arrest, but it sure would interest the FBI's cargo theft task force." The mention of the FBI caused a subtle change in the men's stance. The leader's eyes narrowed, studying Tom more carefully now. "You're bluffing, old man. You're just another wash-up trying to play hero." Tom smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe I spent 20 years working cargo theft cases for the Bureau before I started driving. Maybe I still keep in touch with the task force. Maybe I've been watching you boys work this stop for the past hour, documenting everything. Or maybe I'm just a fat old trucker who doesn't know when to mind his own business. Want to bet your operation on which one it is?" He could see the calculations running behind the leader's eyes. These men were professionals, they knew how to assess risk versus reward. Tom had just changed that equation significantly. Even if they didn't fully believe his FBI claim, he'd demonstrated too much knowledge of their methods to be ignored. The sound of distant sirens made the decision for them. Tom had positioned himself perfectly, there was no way to get to him or the young driver without creating a scene that would draw immediate attention from the growing number of witnesses in the parking lot. "We're done here," the leader announced, trying to maintain some authority in his voice. "But you watch yourself, old-timer. Roads are dangerous at night." The threat was delivered with professional smoothness, but Tom could hear the uncertainty beneath it. As the three men walked away, maintaining a casual pace that wouldn't draw attention, Tom turned to the young driver. "You okay there, son?" The driver nodded, visibly shaken but trying to hide it. "That was, thank you, sir. I didn't know what they were going to do." The young man's voice was steadier now, but his hands were still trembling slightly. Tom watched the three men climb into a dark SUV parked at the far end of the lot. "They'll be hitting other stops along this route. Mind if I take a look at your truck? There's a chance they planted something while they were distracting you." The next 15 minutes were spent conducting a thorough search of the young driver's rig. Tom found what he was looking for under the trailer, a small magnetic GPS tracker, commonly used by theft crews to follow targeted cargo. He'd seen dozens of similar devices during his FBI days. "See this?" he showed the device to the driver. "They were planning to follow you, probably hit your truck somewhere more isolated. You'll want to file a report with the state police, it'll help establish a pattern when they catch these guys." As local police cars pulled into the truck stop, Tom quietly slipped away to his own rig. He had no desire to spend hours giving statements or drawing attention to himself. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a call to an old colleague at the FBI's cargo theft task force. Some habits died hard, and keeping tabs on criminal crews was one of them. The parking lot had returned to its normal evening routine, but Tom knew the night's events weren't over. Those men would be back, maybe not at this stop, but somewhere along the route. And next time, they'd be more careful about picking their targets. But that was okay, Tom had gotten what he needed. The GPS tracker would be valuable evidence, and his old FBI contacts would know exactly what to do with the information he'd gathered. The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Tom pulled his rig onto the interstate. He'd spent the night coordinating with his former FBI colleagues, sharing details about the crew's methods and the GPS tracker he'd discovered. His old partner, now heading the regional cargo theft task force, had been particularly interested in the crew's sophisticated approach. 2 hours into his drive, Tom noticed a familiar dark SUV merge onto the highway 3 exits back. He smiled to himself. They were good, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection by an ordinary driver, but not good enough to fool someone with his training. He'd expected them to follow him rather than the young driver from last night. After all, he'd made himself a much more interesting target. "Let's see how committed you boys are," Tom muttered, reaching for his CB radio. Over the years, he'd built up a network of trusted drivers who understood the importance of watching each other's backs. It was time to put that network to use. Breaker 1 to 9, this is Wheeler. Got a coffee break coming up at mile marker 147. Any friendly faces in the area? Tom used the casual language of truckers, but his message carried a specific meaning to those who knew him. Several responses crackled over the radio, and Tom recognized the voices of drivers he'd helped in the past. Within minutes, he had 4 trusted colleagues converging on the small truck stop ahead. The crew tailing him wouldn't know it, but they were about to drive into a carefully orchestrated trap. The truck stop at mile marker 147 was smaller than the Prairie Wind, just a fuel station with a tiny diner attached. Tom pulled his rig around the back, positioning it so that the security cameras had a clear view of the approach. He'd already called ahead to the owner, an old friend from his FBI days who'd retired to run this place. As Tom climbed down from his cab, he spotted the SUV pulling into the lot. They parked at a distance, trying to look casual but failing to blend in at a stop that rarely saw anything but trucks and local vehicles. Through the diner's windows, he could see his fellow drivers already inside, strategically seated to watch every angle of the parking lot. Inside the diner, Tom took a seat at the counter, ordering coffee from the waitress while keeping one eye on the reflection in the chrome napkin holder. The bell above the door chimed as 2 of the men from last night entered, the leader and one of his associates. The third would be watching the trucks, Tom knew. It was a standard tactic. "Mind if we join you?" the leader asked, sliding onto the stool next to Tom. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were hard. "Think we got off on the wrong foot last night." Tom took a slow sip of his coffee. "Free country. Though I gotta wonder why you boys are so interested in my company." Around the diner, his fellow drivers maintained their casual poses, but Tom knew they were ready to move if needed. The leader leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "That was quite a story you told last night. About being FBI. Made us curious, so we did some checking. Funny thing, can't find any record of a Tom Wheeler in the Bureau's history." "That so?" Tom replied, amusement tinging his voice. "Well, might be because Tom Wheeler isn't the name I used back then. Might be because some records stay sealed even after retirement. Or might be because I was spinning tales to impress some troublemakers. Question is, why'd you drive 200 miles to find out?" The leader's partner shifted uncomfortably, but the leader maintained his composure. "We run a legitimate business, Mr. Wheeler. Don't appreciate accusations that suggest otherwise. Legitimate businesses don't usually plant GPS trackers on other people's vehicles." Tom countered, pulling the device from his pocket and setting it on the counter between them. "And they don't usually travel in crews, testing truck doors at night." The leader's expression tightened. "Could have been anyone's. No way to prove where that came from." "See, that's where you're wrong," Tom replied, his voice still casual but carrying an edge of authority that made both men tense. "Because this particular model has a serial number registered to a company that's been under investigation for months. The moment I called it in last night, it matched an ongoing FBI case." He turned slightly on his stool, making sure they could see his face clearly. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You boys are going to walk out of here, get in your vehicle, and drive away. Your third man, the one who's probably checking my trailer right now, he's going to join you. And you're going to find a new line of work, because this route isn't going to be profitable for you anymore." The leader's hand twitched toward his jacket, but he froze as he noticed the other drivers in the diner had suddenly become very still, all attention focused on their table. Even his partner had taken a step back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "You really want to find out how many cameras caught you following me here?" Tom asked quietly. "How many witnesses can place you with me right before something unfortunate happened? How many of these drivers are already sending pictures of you and your vehicle to my old colleagues?" The leader stood slowly, his attempt at a threatening smile failing to mask his uncertainty. "You're making a lot of assumptions about us, old man." "No assumptions," Tom replied. "Just experience. 20 years of watching crews like yours work. Different faces, same methods. And you know what? The smart ones know when to walk away." He gestured toward the door. "Be smart." For a moment, the leader stood there, clearly weighing his options. Then his partner tugged at his sleeve, whispering something urgent. Through the window, Tom could see their third man hurrying back from the truck parking area, looking nervous. "This isn't over," the leader said, but the threat sounded hollow. "It is," Tom corrected him. "Because right now, you're just suspects in an attempted cargo theft. Walk away, and that's all you'll ever be. Stay, and you become something much more interesting to my former colleagues." The men backed toward the door, trying to maintain their dignity but clearly rattled. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Tom noticed one of his fellow drivers taking pictures of their license plate. Another was already on the phone, presumably with law enforcement. "Coffee's on the house," the waitress said, refilling his cup. "Those boys been causing trouble up and down this route for months." Tom nodded, watching the SUV disappear down the highway. He knew they wouldn't be back, at least not to this route. Crews like that survived by avoiding heat, and he'd just made things too hot for them here. But there would be others. There always were. Back on the road, Tom kept one eye on his mirrors out of habit, though he knew the crew wouldn't return, not today, anyway. His CB radio crackled with chatter from other drivers, sharing updates about traffic and road conditions, but underneath ran a current of more serious conversation about the morning's events. The trucking community had its own way of handling trouble. Within hours, descriptions of the crew and their vehicle would spread up and down the route, passed from driver to driver at every stop. It wasn't just about protection, it was about preserving a way of life that was becoming increasingly rare in today's world. Tom's phone buzzed with a text from his old FBI partner. GPS tracker confirmed. Matches string of thefts in 3 states. Task force moving on warehouse location. Good work, old friend. A smile crossed Tom's weathered face as he read the message. He'd known the crew's operation was too sophisticated to be isolated. They had to have a base somewhere, a place to store stolen cargo before moving it through their networks. By letting them think they were following him, he'd given the task force time to trace the GPS tracker's signal back to its source. At his next rest stop, Tom noticed a group of younger drivers gathered around his truck. Word had spread fast about the morning's confrontation, and now they were eager to learn from someone who'd stood up to the crew. He recognized the same look he used to see in rookie agents, that mix of enthusiasm and uncertainty that came with facing real danger for the first time. "Mr. Wheeler," one of them called out as he approached. "Is it true you used to be FBI? Been hearing all kinds of stories on the radio." The young man couldn't have been more than 25, probably fresh to long-haul driving. Tom settled onto a bench, gesturing for them to join him. "Stories tend to grow in the telling," he said with a quiet chuckle. "But yeah, I spent some time with the Bureau. These days, though, I'm just another driver trying to keep the road safe for all of us." "But how'd you know they were bad news?" another driver asked. "I mean, lots of folks hang around truck stops." Tom took a moment to gather his thoughts, knowing this was an opportunity to pass on important knowledge. "It's about patterns," he explained. "Professional crews, they have a way of moving, of watching. They're not just random troublemakers, they're running a business, albeit an illegal one. They study routes, schedules, cargo manifests. They know which trucks to target and when. He pulled out his phone, showing them photos he'd taken of the crew's behavioral patterns. See how they positioned themselves. How they isolated targets. That's not random. They're professionals, which makes them both more dangerous and more predictable. The younger drivers leaned in, studying the images with new understanding. Tom continued, but here's what's really important, they rely on us not working together. Every driver who stays silent, who doesn't warn others or report suspicious activity, makes their job easier. One of the drivers, a woman who'd been quietly listening, spoke up. That's why you called for backup this morning on the CB. You weren't just protecting yourself, you were setting up a net. Tom nodded approvingly. Exactly. In my FBI days, we had badges and backup. Out here, we have each other. That's why these crews target new drivers, isolated drivers. They avoid the ones who stay connected, who know their neighbors on the road. The conversation was interrupted by Tom's phone ringing. It was his old partner again, this time with news that made him sit up straighter. The task force had moved on the warehouse location, finding not just stolen cargo but evidence linking the crew to a larger criminal organization operating across multiple states. They're saying your GPS tracker broke the case wide open, his partner said. Found manifests, shipping schedules, corrupt insider contacts, whole operations coming down. Not bad for a retired agent turned trucker. Tom shared the news with the gathered drivers, watching their expressions shift from curiosity to understanding. This wasn't just about one crew or one route anymore, it was about protecting their entire community. So what do we do? The youngest driver asked. How do we protect ourselves? You start by being aware, Tom replied. Learn to spot the signs. Share information. Use your CB, join driver networks, report suspicious activity. But most importantly, look out for each other. The highways can be lonely, but they don't have to be. As the afternoon wore on, more drivers joined the impromptu gathering. Tom found himself sharing stories from both his FBI days and his trucking experiences, helping them understand how to protect themselves and their cargo. He taught them about common theft techniques, warning signs to watch for, and the importance of maintaining situational awareness. The thing about these crews, he explained, is they're counting on us being isolated, being easy targets. But together, we're anything but easy targets. One of the older drivers nodded in agreement. Been driving 30 years, never seen anything like what you pulled off this morning. Got them to expose themselves without any violence, any confrontation. That's something worth learning. Tom smiled. That's the key right there. Violence is what they expect, what they're prepared for. But organization, communication, community, that's what really defeats them. They can handle one driver, maybe two. But they can't handle an entire network of drivers looking out for each other. As the sun began to set, the group gradually dispersed, each driver heading back to their rigs with new knowledge and a stronger sense of community. Tom watched them go, reminded of his early days training new agents. The lessons were different now, but the principle remained the same: knowledge and cooperation were the best weapons against those who would prey on others. His phone buzzed again, another update from the task force. The crew's leader had been identified, linking him to similar operations in other states. The investigation was expanding, revealing a network of cargo theft that stretched across the country. What had started as a simple confrontation at a truck stop was unraveling years of organized crime. Tom climbed back into his cab, ready to continue his route. He knew the crews would adapt, find new methods, new targets. But so would the drivers. The word was out now, the community awakened to the threat. His years in the FBI had taught him that criminals could be caught, but it was the strengthening of communities that truly made a difference. As he pulled back onto the highway, his CB crackled with familiar voices sharing updates about road conditions ahead. But now there was something else in their chatter, a new awareness, a sense of vigilance. The night's darkness didn't seem quite so lonely anymore. 3 days after the confrontation at the truck stop, Tom sat in a small diner just outside of Chicago, reviewing photos on his laptop. His old FBI partner had sent him surveillance images from the warehouse raid, and each one confirmed what he'd suspected about the crew's operation. This wasn't just about cargo theft, it was about something much bigger. The waitress, an older woman named Pearl who'd been serving truckers for 30 years, topped off his coffee and glanced at his screen. "Those the fellows who've been causing trouble down the I-80 corridor?" she asked, her voice low enough that only Tom could hear. "You know about them?" Tom looked up, interested. Truck stop workers often knew more about what happened on the roads than law enforcement did. Pearl nodded, settling into the booth across from him. "Been hearing stories for months. Drivers losing cargo, getting threatened. Some stopped coming through altogether, started taking longer routes to avoid this stretch." Tom closed his laptop, giving Pearl his full attention. In his FBI days, he'd learned that sometimes the best information came from people who watched and listened while others ignored them. "What else have you noticed?" "Well," Pearl leaned forward, "about 6 months ago, we started getting these new customers. Not truckers, not locals. Men in nice suits, showing up at odd hours. Always sat in that booth over there, always met with someone different." She gestured to a corner booth with a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot. Tom's instincts tingled. High-level criminal organizations often use truck stops as meeting points. They were public enough to avoid suspicion but private enough for business. These men in suits, they ever meet with any of the crew from the other night? Pearl's eyes narrowed in concentration. "Come to think of it, that fellow who was giving you trouble? Saw him here about a month ago, talking with one of the suit types. Didn't think much of it at the time, but looking at these pictures." She pointed to one of the surveillance photos showing shipping manifests found in the warehouse. Tom studied the image more carefully. Among the papers visible in the photo was a document with a familiar corporate logo, one he'd seen on the briefcase of one of the suit types Pearl described. His phone buzzed with a text from his FBI partner, "Found something interesting in the financial records. Shell companies all trace back to legitimate shipping corporation. Need your eyes on this." The pieces were starting to fit together. The crew wasn't just stealing cargo, they were part of a sophisticated corporate espionage operation. They were targeting specific shipments, gathering intelligence on routes and schedules, all while making it look like random theft. As if confirming his thoughts, a group of drivers entered the diner, including several who'd been present during the confrontation days earlier. They spotted Tom and made their way over, faces serious. "Mr. Wheeler," one of them said, pulling out his phone. "Been seeing something strange up and down the route. Those guys who were following you? They weren't the only ones." He showed Tom a series of photos taken at different truck stops, showing similar groups of men using the same tactics. Tom nodded slowly. "They're spotters. Part of a larger network. They identify targets, track patterns, gather intelligence." He looked at Pearl. "Those men in suits? They're the ones who make it all look legitimate." The drivers exchanged worried glances. "How deep does this go?" one asked. "Deeper than anyone suspected," Tom replied, pulling up another email from his partner. The warehouse raid uncovered evidence of corporate involvement. Someone high up is using these crews to gather intelligence on shipping patterns, customer lists, supply chain vulnerabilities. Pearl shook her head. "All this time, we thought it was just theft. But they were really mapping out the entire industry, weren't they?" "Exactly," Tom confirmed. "Think about it, what's worth more than the cargo itself? The information about who's shipping what, when, and where. In the right hands, that kind of intelligence is priceless. One of the younger drivers spoke up. That's why they targeted newer drivers, isn't it? We're more likely to have regular routes, predictable schedules. Tom smiled approvingly. You're catching on. They weren't just looking for easy marks, they were building a database. Every GPS tracker they planted, every driver they intimidated, every schedule they discovered added to their intelligence. His phone buzzed again, another update from the task force. The investigation had expanded to include corporate fraud investigators. The evidence from the warehouse had led to search warrants for offices in 3 states. But here's what they didn't count on, Tom continued, looking around at the gathered drivers. They didn't expect us to work together. Every photo you've taken, every report you've made, every warning you've shared on the CB, it's all helped expose their operation. Pearl refilled coffee cups as more drivers joined the discussion. Tom found himself drawing on his FBI training to explain complex criminal methodologies in simple terms, helping them understand not just what to look for, but why certain patterns mattered. The key is documentation, he explained, showing them how to photograph suspicious activity without being obvious about it. These organizations rely on people being too scared or too busy to keep records. But when we work together, share information, establish patterns, that's when we can make a real difference. As the afternoon wore on, Tom's phone kept buzzing with updates from the investigation. The corporate connection had opened new avenues of inquiry, leading to discoveries of similar operations in other regions. What had started with one crew at one truck stop was unraveling a nationwide network of corporate espionage. So what happens now? One of the drivers asked. Tom leaned back, considering. Now, we stay vigilant. The organization might be exposed, but others will try to fill the void. But they'll find it harder now. Because now we know what to look for, and more importantly, we know how to work together. Pearl, who had been listening while serving other customers, returned to their table. You know what I love about all this, she said with a smile. For years, these big shots in suits thought they could use our truck stops, our highways, our community for their schemes. But in the end, it was this same community that brought them down. Tom couldn't help but agree. In his FBI days, he'd seen how the biggest cases often cracked because ordinary people decided to pay attention, to speak up, to work together. Now, watching these drivers share information and strategies, he saw the same principle at work. His laptop pinged with a new email, surveillance photos from another truck stop showing more spotters using the same tactics. But this time, the drivers were ready. The photos showed truckers documenting the suspicious activity, sharing information over CB radio, working together to protect their community. You've started something here, Pearl observed, watching the drivers study the photos. Something bigger than just catching one crew. Tom nodded. Sometimes the best way to fight organized crime is with organized resistance. Not with violence or confrontation, but with awareness, communication, and community. The next morning dawned gray and misty as Tom pulled his rig into a major distribution center outside Indianapolis. His old FBI partner had called late the previous night with news that changed everything. They'd identified the corporate mastermind behind the operation, and he was scheduled to make an appearance at this very facility. The parking lot was already busy with trucks coming and going, drivers checking manifests and schedules. But Tom's trained eye noticed something different today. The drivers were more alert, more aware of their surroundings. Word had spread quickly through the trucking community about what to watch for. Wheeler, you reading this? His CB crackled with a familiar voice. It was one of the drivers from the diner yesterday. Got eyes on a black sedan that's been circling the lot for 20 minutes. Same pattern as before. Tom checked his mirrors, spotting the vehicle in question. Copy that. Keep your distance, but keep watching. Things might get interesting today. He didn't share what he knew about the corporate connection. That information was still part of an active FBI investigation. But he appreciated how the drivers had adapted, becoming more observant and communicative. Inside the distribution center's office, Tom handed over his delivery paperwork to the clerk, all while keeping one eye on the lobby. His years of FBI surveillance had taught him how to appear completely focused on a routine task while actually monitoring his surroundings. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit entered the building, flanked by two others who were trying hard not to look like security personnel. Tom recognized him immediately from the surveillance photos his partner had sent. James Henderson, VP of Strategic Development at one of the country's largest shipping corporations. What the public saw was a successful executive known for innovative logistics solutions. What Tom and the FBI task force saw was the architect of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used cargo theft as cover for corporate espionage. Tom's phone vibrated silently in his pocket, the signal that FBI surveillance teams were in position around the facility. His role today wasn't to make an arrest or confront anyone. He was here to observe and confirm patterns of behavior that would help build the federal case. The clerk handed back his paperwork, and Tom made his way to the driver's lounge, choosing a seat that gave him a clear view of Henderson's meeting in the glass-walled conference room. Through his earpiece, disguised as a common Bluetooth headset, he could hear updates from the surveillance team. Target is meeting with regional distribution managers, a voice reported. Standard quarterly review on paper, but watch for any separate conversations afterward. Tom noticed something else. The crew from the truck stop incident hadn't been seen since their confrontation, but their tactics were being repeated by new faces. Throughout the morning, he observed several well-dressed individuals moving through the facility, engaging in what appeared to be casual conversations with drivers and staff. His CB radio, turned low but audible, carried a steady stream of updates from drivers outside. They'd created an informal surveillance network of their own, sharing observations about suspicious vehicles and individuals. Wheeler, a voice crackled through, got another suit walking the lot. Third one this hour. Same pattern, checking manifests, asking about routes. Copy that, Tom responded. Keep logging times and descriptions. It all helps build the picture. He knew the FBI was monitoring these communications, adding them to their growing body of evidence. Around noon, Henderson emerged from his meeting. Instead of heading for the exit, he made his way to the driver's lounge. Tom pretended to be absorbed in his phone as the executive approached. Quite a community you drivers have, Henderson said, taking the seat opposite Tom. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. Word travels fast on the road, doesn't it? Tom looked up, matching Henderson's casual demeanor. Nature of the business. Good news, bad news, warnings about trouble. It all moves up and down the highways pretty quick. Yes, I've noticed that. Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Especially lately. Seems there's been a lot of talk about cargo security, suspicious activities. Almost as if someone's been organizing things. Just drivers looking out for each other, Tom replied. Been some trouble on the routes lately. Theft, harassment, that sort of thing. Makes folks more careful. Henderson leaned forward slightly. You know, Mr. Wheeler, and yes, I know who you are, this industry is changing. The old ways, the independent driver culture, it's all becoming obsolete. What's really valuable now is information. Route efficiency, delivery patterns, customer relationships. The future belongs to those who can gather and use that information effectively. Even if that means stealing it? Tom asked quietly. Henderson's smile widened. Stealing is such an ugly word. We prefer to think of it as market research. Your little crusade, turning drivers into amateur surveillance networks, it's impressive, but ultimately futile. We're too big, too well connected. And we're not the only ones doing this. That's where you're wrong, Tom replied. See, what you call obsolete, I call community. And communities protect their own. Just then, Tom's phone buzzed with a specific pattern, the signal that the FBI had what they needed. Henderson's meeting, his conversation with Tom, his inadvertent admission of corporate involvement, it had all been recorded. "Interesting chat," Tom said, standing up. "Might want to have it again sometime. Maybe with some federal agents present." Henderson's composed expression faltered for just a moment as he realized the implications. Outside, the sound of vehicles moving into position could be heard. His security personnel appeared at the lounge entrance, but federal agents were already moving in. Tom stepped back, watching as Henderson was taken into custody. The executive's protests about calling his lawyers echoed through the facility. Around them, drivers and staff gathered, watching as the man who had treated their industry as his personal intelligence network was led away. One of the younger drivers approached Tom. "You knew this was coming, didn't you? All that talk about documentation, about working together, you were building a case." Tom nodded. "The FBI needed evidence of corporate involvement. Henderson got careless because he underestimated us. Thought we were just simple truckers who couldn't possibly understand his sophisticated operation." Through the windows, he could see more FBI vehicles arriving. Teams were already securing computers and documents throughout the facility. But what really caught his attention was the group of drivers gathering in the parking lot, sharing information with investigators. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from his old partner: corporate raids happening simultaneously in 6 cities. Whole networks coming down. Not bad for a retired agent and his trucker friends. Tom smiled, watching the scene unfold. Henderson had been right about one thing: the industry was changing. But he'd been wrong about what that meant. The future didn't belong to corporate spies and information thieves. It belonged to communities that stood together, that adapted and protected each other. A week after Henderson's arrest, Tom sat in his favorite booth at the Prairie Wind truck stop, where this whole story had begun. The place was busier than usual, filled with drivers who'd come to share their experiences with federal investigators. The truck stop had become an unofficial headquarters for the expanding investigation. Betty, the store clerk who'd first noticed the suspicious crew, was now helping coordinate witness statements. She'd set up a system to organize the flood of information coming in from drivers across the country. Her counter had become a hub of activity, with drivers stopping by to share photos, stories, and observations. "Can't believe how big this thing got," Betty said, sliding a fresh cup of coffee in front of Tom. "Started with one crew causing trouble, and now look at it." She gestured to the wall behind her counter, where a map was covered in pins marking locations of related criminal activity. Tom nodded, studying the pattern of pins. "That's usually how these cases break: start pulling one thread, and the whole sweater unravels. But I've never seen the trucking community come together like this before." His phone lit up with another update from the FBI task force. The investigation had expanded beyond Henderson's corporation to reveal similar operations at other companies. What they'd uncovered was a widespread pattern of corporate espionage disguised as cargo theft. The young driver from the first confrontation walked in, now carrying himself with new confidence. He'd become something of a leader among the younger drivers, helping organize their information-sharing network. "Mr. Wheeler," he called out, sliding into the booth across from Tom. "You're not going to believe what we found." He pulled out his tablet, showing a series of photos taken at different truck stops across 3 states. "Remember those guys in suits Henderson was working with? We've been tracking their movements, just like you taught us." Tom examined the photos carefully. The drivers had documented meeting patterns, vehicle descriptions, and timing, all the elements needed for a proper investigation. They'd taken his lessons about observation and documentation to heart. After Henderson's arrest, they started changing their routines, the young driver continued. But they couldn't change everything. Too many of us watching now, sharing information. They're finding it harder to operate. Outside, the sound of engines announced the arrival of more trucks. The parking lot was filling up with drivers who'd altered their routes to stop here, turning the prairie wind into an impromptu command center for their grassroots security network. Tom's old FBI partner arrived, looking both impressed and amused by the scene. "You've created quite an operation here," he said, taking in the wall of evidence and the groups of drivers sharing information. "These guys are doing better surveillance work than some of our rookie agents." "They're motivated," Tom replied. "This isn't just about stopping crime anymore. It's about protecting their way of life." A group of veteran drivers who'd been listening approached their booth. One of them, a woman with 30 years of experience on the roads, spoke up. "You know what's really changed? We're not just passing through anymore. Used to be, you'd stop, fuel up, maybe grab a coffee, and move on. Now we're really seeing what's happening around us." Tom understood exactly what she meant. The trucking community had always been connected through CB radio and shared stories, but this was different. They'd developed a new awareness, a systematic way of observing and sharing information that made them much harder to target. His phone buzzed with another message. The FBI had just arrested 3 more corporate executives based on evidence provided by the trucking network. The driver's documentation of suspicious activities had helped establish patterns that proved crucial to the investigation. "Remember what Henderson said about the industry changing?" Tom asked the gathered group. He thought technology and corporate espionage would make the traditional trucking community obsolete. "Instead, we've adapted. Used our connections, our communication networks, to become stronger." Betty brought over more coffee for the growing group. "Had another corporate type come through yesterday," she reported. "All slick and professional, asking questions about shipping patterns. But this time, we were ready. Had 3 drivers document everything he did, everywhere he went. Sent it all straight to your task force." Tom's partner nodded approvingly. "That's the thing about these corporate operations, they rely on being invisible, on people not paying attention. But now? They can't move without being noticed." The young driver grinned. "It's like you said, Mr. Wheeler, organization beats intimidation. They thought we were just simple truckers, easy targets. Didn't expect us to turn their own surveillance tactics against them." Through the windows, Tom could see more drivers arriving, some he recognized from the confrontation days ago, others new faces who'd joined the network as word spread. Each brought their own stories, their own observations, adding to the growing body of evidence. "You've started something here that's bigger than just stopping cargo theft," his partner observed. "You've shown these drivers how to protect themselves, how to work together. That's going to have lasting effects." Tom watched as Betty added another pin to the map, marking a new location where suspicious activity had been reported. The pattern was clear now. What had seemed like isolated incidents were part of a larger network of corporate espionage. "The roads are changing," one of the veteran drivers said. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. We're more connected now, more aware. These corporations thought they could use that connectivity to exploit us. Instead, we're using it to protect each other." As the afternoon wore on, more drivers arrived to share their stories and observations. Tom found himself moving from group to group, helping them refine their observation techniques, teaching them how to document suspicious activities effectively. His phone kept buzzing with updates from the task force: more arrests, more evidence uncovered, more connections revealed. But what really caught his attention was how the drivers had taken ownership of their security. They weren't just passing along information anymore, they were actively working to protect their community. "You know what Henderson never understood?" Tom said to his partner as they watched the activity in the truck stop. "He thought information was just a commodity to be stolen and sold. But real information, the kind that matters, comes from community. From people working together, sharing what they know, looking out for each other." The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the parking lot filled with trucks. But unlike a week ago, these shadows didn't hide any threats. The trucking community had reclaimed their space, turned their stops from potential targets into centers of resistance against corporate crime. 1 month after Henderson's arrest, Tom Wheeler pulled his rig into a truck stop he'd never visited before, somewhere in the middle of Kansas. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a sight he'd seen thousands of times but never tired of. As he climbed down from his cab, he noticed something that made him smile: drivers gathering in small groups, sharing information, watching their surroundings with practiced awareness. The changes he'd helped start had spread far beyond that first confrontation at the Prairie Wind. What began as a response to one crew's activities had evolved into a nationwide network of vigilant drivers protecting their profession. Inside the store, Tom ordered his usual coffee and took a seat at the counter. The television mounted on the wall was showing a news report about the ongoing investigation into corporate espionage in the trucking industry. Henderson's arrest had been just the beginning. 7 major corporations had been implicated, dozens of executives arrested, and millions in stolen cargo and data recovered. "You're him, aren't you?" the cashier asked, her name tag reading, Rose. "The FBI agent turned trucker who started all this?" Word had spread through the trucking community, though the media had kept his name out of their reports at the task force's request. Tom nodded modestly. "Just did what needed doing." The real change came from the drivers themselves. A group of drivers at a nearby table recognized him and waved him over. As he joined them, he saw they were reviewing security footage on a tablet, something that would have been unusual just a month ago but was now becoming standard practice. "Got something interesting to show you," one of them said, pulling up a series of photos. "Caught some suits trying the old playbook at a stop in Oklahoma. But watch what happens." The photos showed a scene Tom had witnessed many times: corporate operatives attempting to gather intelligence under the guise of casual conversation. But this time, the drivers were ready. The images showed them documenting the activity, sharing real-time updates with other drivers, and coordinating with local law enforcement. They didn't even get through their first approach before they realized they'd been made, the driver explained proudly. "This is happening all over now. They can't operate like they used to." Tom's phone buzzed with a message from his old FBI partner: "Final tallies coming in. Corporate espionage ring worth over $500 million shut down. Your trucker network provided 60% of the evidence. Not bad for a retirement project." The news brought a sense of satisfaction, but what really mattered was happening right here in this truck stop. Drivers from different companies, different backgrounds, all working together to protect their profession. The old isolation that made them vulnerable had been replaced by a strong sense of community. "You know what's really changed?" one of the older drivers said, gesturing around the room. "We're not just passing through anymore. Every stop is a chance to connect, to share information, to look out for each other." A younger driver chimed in, "My first year on the road, I felt like I was always on my own. Now, I know I've got backup at every stop. People watching out for me, teaching me what to look for." Tom listened as they shared stories about recent encounters with suspicious activities. The drivers weren't just passing along warnings anymore, they were actively documenting patterns, coordinating responses, and working with law enforcement when needed. His CB radio crackled with chatter, and he recognized the new codes and phrases that had evolved to share security information. What started as a simple warning system had grown into a sophisticated network that corporate infiltrators couldn't crack. "You know what Henderson told me right before he was arrested?" Tom shared with the group. "He said the old ways were becoming obsolete. That information was the only thing that mattered." He paused, looking around at the gathered drivers. But he was wrong about what kind of information matters most. Rose brought over fresh coffee for everyone as more drivers joined the conversation. Through the windows, Tom could see trucks continuing to arrive for the night, their drivers automatically scanning the lot, checking in with others, maintaining the vigilance that had become second nature. The corporations thought they could use technology to make us obsolete, one driver observed. Instead, we used our connections to become stronger. Funny how that worked out. Tom nodded. That's because they never understood what really moves across these highways. It's not just cargo, it's trust, community, shared knowledge. Those are things you can't steal or buy. His phone lit up with another update. The task force had just arrested 2 more corporate executives based on evidence provided by the trucking network. But more importantly, attempted cargo theft rates had dropped significantly across all major routes. "You've done more than just stop some thieves," Rose commented as she collected empty coffee cups. "You've changed how these roads work." A driver who'd been quietly listening spoke up. "My daughter's starting trucking school next month. Last year, I would have tried to talk her out of it. Too dangerous, too isolated. But now? I know she'll be joining a real community. People who look out for each other." As the evening wore on, Tom found himself sharing less about security techniques and more about the importance of maintaining these connections they'd built. The technical skills were important, but it was the strength of the community that would keep the roads safe. Outside, the parking lot had filled up for the night. Through the windows, Tom could see drivers doing their evening checks, but now they moved with purpose, awareness, and most importantly, confidence. They weren't potential victims anymore, they were active participants in protecting their profession. "You know what the best part is?" one of the veteran drivers said. "The suits in their corporate offices, they still don't get it. They think if they just change their tactics, find new ways to gather intelligence, they can go back to the old ways. But they can't. Because we're not the same anymore." Tom smiled, remembering his early days with the FBI, learning about how communities could be the strongest defense against organized crime. He'd spent years trying to protect people, but now he was watching them protect themselves. His phone buzzed one final time for the night, a message from Betty at the Prairie Wind. "Remember that crew from the first night? Just heard they tried setting up in Texas. Didn't last 2 days before the drivers ran them off. Times really have changed." As Tom prepared to turn in for the night, he looked around at the truck stop one more time. What he saw wasn't just a parking lot full of trucks or a store full of drivers. He saw a community that had found its strength, that had turned their profession's greatest vulnerability, their mobility and isolation, into its greatest defense. The corporate spies and cargo thieves had thought technology would make the traditional trucking community obsolete. Instead, it had helped forge a stronger, more connected community that could protect itself. Tom Wheeler, the FBI agent turned trucker, had helped start this change, but it was the drivers themselves who had turned it into something that would last. As he climbed back into his cab for the night, his CB radio crackled one last time. "Good night, Wheeler. Thanks for showing us the way. We'll take it from here." And he knew that the roads were in good hands.